All right. Welcome back, guys, to the Self-Selecting Podcast, episode 9. Super grateful for the feedback on the last episode. Yes, thank you for the Q&A responses, for the shares on Instagram, for the comments on YouTube. Seriously, I appreciate it. I'm glad y'all are liking the video. Today, what are we talking about? I was asked to speak for a seminar in order to teach coaches. It's like a coaching seminar, so it's private, not open to the public, specifically on how to establish buy-in for the female athlete entering into a build phase. Now, this is something that I didn't set out to do. It's not like I was like, hey, my target demographic is going to be individuals who need to build and want to do it in like a systematic way. But what I found is like really over the last 2 years, there's a lot of women who come to me. And I think it largely has to do with the content that I've put out where I've been like, hey, you need to fucking grow. Like, I get that you like being lean. Like, trust me, I like being lean too. That's why I do bodybuilding. That's why I get as lean as I do. I prefer that look. One of the bigger challenges, I would say, is the fact that you can only get one outcome from dieting. Like, dieting in itself, fat loss is only going to lead you to one place, and that is having less volume, like being smaller. Dieting in itself, sure, if you already have the muscle, it could result in an improvement in shape, obviously an improvement in composition, relative fat to fat-free mass. But if you're like me, like when I got into the sport, I just thought, okay, like dieting, that's how I get to my goals. Fat loss, cutting down, skinnier, weighing less. Very, very disordered, and I'm aware of that. But it wasn't until I did my first 2 shows, that I was like, okay, something else needs to occur. Like, I'm missing a key component here that, frankly, like, this is the thing that's going to make the biggest difference in the way that I look at the end of a fat loss phase. Now, this is the reason this is so hard, I think, for individuals to sign up for, to have buy-in, is because, it was instilled at such a young age that weighing more and being fatter and just being bigger in general, that inherently was worse. It was bad. There was a negative association with gaining weight. Now, for me, that was established like very early on. I'm talking like 4th, 5th, 6th grade. I think for most women, that is the case. I think most people are going to find, or most women, men too, are going to find that like these beliefs, they aren't ones that were recently developed. And largely they've been negatively reinforced, likely this person's entire life. So as a coach, when you're bringing someone on, or even as an athlete, if you're like, hey, like, I know I need to do this, it is so fucking hard for me to get past what I've believed and what I've been told my entire life. How do I do it? Well, for one, and this is probably going to sound dumb to some people, but like the terminology, the vernacular, like calling it a bulk, for instance, like that word, it's not a pretty word. Like I always think of like psyllium husk fiber. I'm like, that's not the word that I would use when we're talking about like that building phase. But like, taking me back to like my first 2 competitions, I associated the term bulk. That's what everyone was calling it back 2015. I associated this with the idea that this is what men do in order to put on muscle. This is what they do in between seasons, like bodybuilders. So the idea of like, okay, me as a female at the time, I was like 125, 130. It was very small. I was a teenager. I was 19. I really... it didn't vibe well with me, the idea that, okay, I'm going to enter into a bulk. Like that in itself, the wording was very intimidating. I didn't want to tell people, oh, I'm in a bulking phase. Like it just, over the years, what I've done, I just started calling it like an intentional growth phase, an intentional build, an improvement season, or a structured off season. I'm using terms that frankly, I think are more representative of what it actually is, because even today, when we call it off season, there is such a let me shit on you mentality on social media with people like, oh, they're in their off season. I know what that means. And whether it's verbalized or not, there are people who still believe that an off season is when you just fuck off and eat whatever you want. And there's no real accountability. Like you're not training as hard. You're kind of getting sloppy and like you're struggling with body image. And truly, that shouldn't be what we're doing during this phase. Like, frankly, the last build that I went through, oh, fuck, I just realized these have little thumb holes. Sweet. Okay. The last structured, like intentional time building last fall, I treated it so strict. Like, I was so on top of things, like getting my creatine in, making sure that like if we were staying out late, like I'm like, okay, well that means that I need to have my meal one before this time, and that means I need to get enough sleep. And okay, like I was always working backwards and structuring everything around my training. It was so intentional, and I mean, I'm not surprised that I saw the progress that I saw, because truly everything that I did at that time, everything was asking myself whether or not this behavior, these actions were conducive with me getting more progress in today's session. Was I going to increase training performance? Was what I'm doing collectively in a 7-day period, was this going to move me closer to my goals? That's what I think it should be. And that's how I like to structure it for clients. I think the terminology, I think calling it a bulk, calling it an off season, I mean, I think inherently there's just a negative connotation with that, which was perpetuated by people shitting on it on social media and saying that like, oh, this is when people get sloppy. There's no on season. It's just an improved, like, it's just people have gotten so tedious and nuanced and high and mighty with like what we need to refer to these periods as. But truly, I think if you're bringing on a new client, or if you yourself, if you're like, hey, this is something I want to do, I don't want it to resemble what I'm imagining. I think that starts with the vernacular. And I think when it comes to establishing like the actual buy-in, you have to understand that like where you're coming from as the athlete, your behaviors, your attitudes going into this phase, and as a coach, like you understand that like when people come to you, how they act, like their biases, they have nothing to do with you. Like I've had people come to me who they are fully bought in on Corey. Like they love like everything I'm doing. They're very supportive. They respect me. They trust me. But they're like, to be honest, where I'm coming from is a place of caution. And frankly, I don't have a lot of faith that this is going to work. It has very little to do with you, the coach, me, the coach. It has to do with the last experience that I had either doing this myself solo, like just completely, hey, I'm going to try to build on my own. I'm going to try to not be in a dieting phase, or working with a coach who inevitably made it very hard to communicate, made them feel like, hey, like you can't really speak up, like reporting non-adherence, it wasn't a thing. And I think that's what we have to be honest about as coaches, is that like there are people that understand like, hey, I need to do this. And frankly, there are people who don't understand, and we'll get to that in a second. But like your starting point is figuring out whether that client understands the value in taking a true improvement season, or whether they don't. Maybe they don't see the value. Maybe they have a very set mindset around what needs to happen. And to them, it looks like, no, in order to get to where I want to go, it needs to be fat loss. If they're aware, or I guess it's probably easier to start this way. If they're not aware that they need to build, what I would first do is start off with like, okay, how do you feel at the end of your diet? Do you like how you look? Like generally, are there any improvements you would make? What are the improvements you would make at the end of your diet? Most people in this space are very willing to be like, oh, I wish I had more glutes. I wish my delts had a little more pop to them. I wish my abs were a little more defined, or, it took so much. Like I dieted my fucking ass off literally to get to the body fat I did. And I didn't see the conditioning that I wanted to. I wish it wasn't as hard, but I wish I also saw better outcomes towards the end of it. And really, like, this is the point where you kind of need to lead your client and figure out if this is the case. I mean, don't lead them into answering the way you want them to answer, but you need to understand, like, were they dissatisfied with that final form at the end of a fat loss phase? Because if it has to do with either not seeing the conditioning that they wanted to in, like, let's say their tie-ins, that's a muscularity thing. If it's, hey, I had to diet so hard in order to get any kind of visibility, insert body part, again, muscularity, that comes down to needing more muscle. You can't just continue to get smaller and smaller. I mean, ultimately, it's only going to result in exactly that. You will get smaller. But there's a certain point where it's like, this is such overkill. Like, I mean, you were pushing so hard to achieve something that frankly, if you had like 5 more pounds of muscle, like it wouldn't feel as strenuous. And maybe you tie this into like understanding that what was the rebound like? Like, how lean did you have to get? And was that feasible? Was it something that ultimately made it much harder to control that post-dieting phase? Did you find that after you finished the diet, it was like, fuck, dude, like I had to get so lean that I'm literally just, I'm ready to binge, eat everything in sight. Like I have no more self-control at this point. If that's the case, I mean, like that's also something we have to talk about. Like if you had to get excessively lean in order to get the visibility that you wanted to see, again, solution to that, make your body to where you only have to get as lean as you need to for the goals at hand. And if that's on stage, well, that's going to be your tie-ins largely for most people. But that has to be explained. Like you have to educate the client on like, hey, this thing that you want, it is possible. But we first have to identify the problem. If they don't know what the problem is, help them see that like truly the muscularity, that's where a lot of people are falling short. Now, let's say they are aware, they're on board. They're like, I know. I'm told like every time I compete, I'm like, I get to the end of a fat loss phase and I'm like, I don't have the shape that I want. Well, at this point, your job is to help them see that like that resistance, like you're aware of what you need to do. You're aware that having more muscle is the answer here. That's the solution. We agree on that, okay? You're not willing to do that. You're resistant to doing that. Well, I would even probe with like, we do the things that we get a benefit from, even the things that we don't do. Even if not doing something is allowing you to circumvent, to avoid a certain feeling of discomfort, very well could be it. Why are you doing that? Particularly if you know that, hey, like this is the solution. Well, we need to figure out where this stems from. And I find that there's usually 3 main fears that people have. So the fear of failure, like their own ability to adhere to something. This largely is going to stem from someone who, let's say their entire life, which this is like me to a T, a restriction, like food restriction doesn't come easy. Like I've developed the skill of it, but truly I'm a fat kid at heart. Like I'm a glutton. My hunger signaling was fucked most of my life. And also being in a sport where we do have to get very lean, it's one of those things I'm like, my finish line is so far past what I would say like Gen Pop, like the standard is for Gen Pop for being lean, that ultimately in order to get to that finish line, I do have to go to a certain point that is very difficult for me. And being in that state, knowing that like, hey, it requires a lot of discipline for me personally to make sure that I can adhere and stay on plan. Really the idea of overeating like intentionally eating at a point that I will gain weight, like objectively, that's the goal, right? That was always very hard for me to swallow. It was like, wait, so if I struggle with restricting, how on earth am I going to not get super fat if I intentionally put my calories and aim to hit this? How can I do that without completely blowing up? And I think what you have to understand is that restriction, it prompts compensation. So like binging is like the number one predictor, of binging is fasting. And that's typically what we see with like yo-yo dieting. Again, me to a T. For the longest time, I'd be like, oh, I'm eating like 1 meal a day. And that meal is going to be whatever I want. It's going to be it's going to be so excessive. And this is the problem that many fall into, is that they're taking the beliefs and really the state that they're in when they're dieting, like when they're in a restricted phase, and they're applying that behavior to a state where they're for them to technically be on plan. That means that they're eating like at specific times and that they're for sure getting enough to satiate themselves. Like, so therefore, if hunger signaling is dysregulated, it should be more regulated at this point. You're not, for the most part, I can almost definitively say this, you're not going to have that same dying hunger that you have when you're in a fat loss phase, when you're at maintenance, or particularly when you're in a slight surplus. You might have cravings. You might have desires to eat off track or to eat things that you technically are not on plan or can't fit into your macros, whatever it is. But the actual, like, the burning hunger that you get, like at the end of one of my preps, I was like, yo, I could fucking binge on like 99.1 like ground turkey right now. that shouldn't carry over. You shouldn't be in that state when you're in a true like improvement season. And if you are, then we need to work on that. But for the most part, that's not going to be the standard. That's not an expected outcome. The fear of physical discomfort, I relate to this as well, but like I have a lot of clients who come to me and they're like, I don't like feeling full. Like I don't like when my stomach is at all full. I like how I feel when I wake up in the morning. I like when I feel empty. I like after I use the restroom. But like I have a best friend who, I swear to fucking God, he's so smart, but he was like, I think I'm allergic to water because every time I drink, like I just feel bloated. You're not, okay? You're not, you're just disordered. Like I'm with you, okay? I get it. For the longest time, I thought the same thing. I think I can't tolerate what the fuck is that? Like that's not a thing. It's something that we do like as individuals we have to recognize, be like, okay, this is like really delusional, but it's also not something that we can like cling to and like white knuckle indefinitely. But particularly for building, that is the physical discomfort that you're going to have to accept. Is like I think many people are okay in this case, the ones that are like, I like feeling empty. I think those people particularly are okay with feeling hungry. And most people, when they think of dieting, like overcoming the restriction, that's one discomfort. And some people struggle with that more. There's another side, I guess the dichotomy of this kind of discomfort is there's the discomfort of feeling stuffed and feeling like, hey, I have to continue eating even if I don't like this feeling. The discomfort that comes in the off season, that's what we're talking about. And that's something that for just like some people struggle with the feeling of being hungry and that leading them to be off track. The other side of the coin is the individual who struggles with feeling full, like they feel too full too frequently. They're very sensitive to feeling full. And therefore, that in itself will cause them to undereat in their off season, in their build. Like they're like, oh, I'm supposed to eat X amount. Well, around 75% of this, that's when I start feeling comfortable. So I'm not going to eat past this. And it's like, you're just as off track as the client who is overeating when they're in a fat loss phase, but can't cut it off. They can't sustain that deficit because it's too hard. The discomfort is too hard. The cognitive dissonance of, frankly, going into a build and knowing that like, hey, I identify as someone who puts, I want my body, I want my physique to reflect that I care about what I look like, and I care about my health and my wellness, and I want my body to convey that outwardly. There's nothing wrong with that. Like, I mean, like we can say it's vain, but I think in today's society, I think it's something that is very admirable for someone to visually encompass the ability to delay gratification for something greater, particularly when it's the opposite. Like physiologically, it's the opposite of what your body wants to do. Like that set point is not easy to sustain once you get there. It's hard as an athlete to convince yourself, be like, okay, I'm going to intentionally enter into a phase where I'm not going to look better. Like I'm actually, best case scenario, I don't make any like any major changes in the course of like 6 to 12 months, yet I am working just as hard. I'm actually working harder than I ever have in the gym, and I'm being very structured with everything that goes into building, yet I'm not going to receive that dopamine response, that chemical response to doing things seemingly correctly on plan. And from an outward perspective, from those around me, people will probably assume that I'm not working very hard. And I have to accept that. Like as an athlete, that's a big ask when a part of your identity is like directly tied to what other people see when they look at your physique. Now, the way I would go about this, I would, for one, list out the advantages and the disadvantages. So when you consider that like your options, okay, you have the option to build and then to not build. If you build, the advantages are, well, you can look vastly different than you've ever looked. And I'm talking from personal experience. Like I've never had the glutes that I have now. And I'm like, yo, that was like, it was not natural, but it was like as natural as like unenhanced as not natural can be. Like it was like just a sprinkle of GH and TRT. Like, I mean, it wasn't like running a cycle, but literally I'm so happy with the progress that I got last year during my build. And like even then, even since then, seeing transient changes in my physique, you know, relative to my training. But that is the advantage, is like you're getting them to buy into and to have faith that they can create the body that they dream of. Like, I mean, that they imagine they can look like that right now seems impossible because why? Because the tissue literally isn't there. Now, the advantages to not building, because that's our second option. The advantages are, well, you get to stay with what you know. You have to enter a state that seemingly like you're hoping pays off, but you have no guarantee because, like, in this case, seeing is believing. Like, you were expecting an outcome and you, at the very beginning, you have nothing to support that outcome is actually going to occur. It's a higher risk in some regards. Now, the downside to not building is that your potential for how you can look. I mean, like, unless for whatever reason, if you're satisfied with the current physique that you're at and like you have no aspirations to continue to improve, which there's nothing wrong with that, but like if you've hit that threshold, cool. But if you're someone who at the end of a diet, if you're like, no, I want to look better, like I want to look closer to insert said girl's name or guy's name, I guess. If you have high aspirations, the downside to not building is your potential is incredibly limited. Now, the way I like to play this out is like, okay, what is the worst case scenario when making the decision, like to build, to not build? Worst case scenario, okay? If you build, what does that look like? Well, the worst case is you get too fat. The thing that you're afraid of, as in like you overshoot, you gain more body fat than you do muscle, and then ultimately you're like, for fuck's sake, like this is exactly what I thought was going to happen. Okay, well, let's be honest. Like if you get to that point, the solution is pretty simple. It's you'll lose the body fat, and like that shouldn't be terribly hard. It can be done. It's very possible, and at this point, you probably have shown yourself like the proof of concept that you're able to do that. Now, the worst case scenario, if you don't build, is like, well, you are stuck wherever you are, but you also know, like subconsciously, whether you want to admit it or not, you know that it's self-created. Like, you know that you chose to stay stuck. And to me, I think that would fucking eat at me. Like things in life where I know I have control over them, and yet I'm choosing to stay. Like I'm choosing the situation I'm in that I'm not happy with. Like, God, that's a slow fucking death. Like, I try to tell clients, I'm like, okay, and really anyone, not just clients, but like even friends who are like, hey, I'm committing to this. It's something I want to do. I need to do it. But I'm nervous. Like I'm nervous. I'm like, yo, fuck, I was too. Like, you're not, you can try it out. Like that's the thing I try to get across to people is like, if you don't like this, you only have to do it once and then be like, yep, not for me. Didn't enjoy that. But the time wasted contemplating whether you should, this like seemingly state of purgatory where your calories are like sometimes in a slight deficit, like 100-calorie deficit, but also sometimes at maintenance, and then other times you're in a slight surplus. Like you are not accomplishing anything. You are literally just, you're maintaining, you're just bobbing idly, like nothing's actually happening. And for individuals who are very motivated and like say, I'm turning all the stones and shit, it's like that state, unless there is an intention, not a lot is happening. And I would even say it's wasted time unless there's a reason to be at maintenance or be in that like bobbing, I don't know, transient maintenance-ish state. It seems pretty wasted if you need more muscle. Now, the final fear is like poor outcome. Let's say you commit to it, but frankly, like the results just aren't good enough, which I have yet to meet someone who's like, oh, like I committed to a 6-month off season and I did everything I was supposed to and it wasn't enough. Like that hasn't existed in my time of doing this. Most people who are truly all in on like, I'm going to build and I'm going to do it in a controlled way. And that means if I fucking start gaining too quickly because maybe I'm not being as tight with food reporting, that means that I'm going to pull back. Okay, well, if you do things correctly, you're going to see compositional changes. But I understand it. Like as humans, we struggle with conceptualizing and visualizing something that we've never seen before. I struggled with this. I'm like, when I'm thinking about my physique, I'm like, what is this actually going to look like when I add 2 pounds of tissue? How will I know what that looks like? We're looking for a lack of regression in body composition. Like we're looking for the scale weight to go up. We're looking for training performance to go up, but we're also looking for body composition to not get shittier. And I know that can sound really backwards, and coaches probably like, what do you mean? Like the best you can do is not let them look worse. It's like, When we're talking about just a couple pounds, which realistically, like, let's consider how much we can actually build, it's not very much, okay? Like, doing things naturally, like, it's not going to be a great deal. And this is especially true. You're going to see even less of a change if you're at a relatively moderate to moderate high body fat. If you're super shredded, and let's say you're shredded, but you didn't do a competition, so you can go straight into building and you're not going to gain a bunch of body fat, great, even better. You're probably going to see those changes come on in what seems like at a faster rate. But I think the best solution, I think one of the solutions needs to be walking that client through, like, hey, recall a time in your life where you were uncertain about an outcome. It needs to be an outcome that actually played out. Like, but you recall that it wasn't guaranteed. Like, it wasn't guaranteed that this was going to happen, but you had to take some kind of leap of faith. Like most things in life, you do have to have some blind faith, and it does get easier after you've done it that first time, but that first time is probably going to be the scariest. And I mean, like, I relate this back to like a hard decision means that both options have pros and cons, like objective ones that can be argued. If you're looking at options and like one is clearly the winner, I mean, then that's not a decision. That's just the option you should go with. It's fucking common sense. Like, that isn't something that is difficult. I can see the rationale with someone being like, hey, I've struggled losing body fat previously, so I'm very hesitant. I'm timid in going into a phase where the goal is to gain weight, because the only other time in my life that I've gained weight, it has not resulted in what I wanted. It resulted in a very dark period in my life. It resulted in me not liking how I looked, actually. Every time that I've had a hard decision, I've tried to play out, I would say, as I've gotten older, every time that I've had a hard decision, not early on. Early on, I did things a little differently, a little more recklessly. As I've gotten older, I've played out like, okay, what decision puts me in a position that is the least fucked? Well, the one where you're playing it safe, where you're paralyzed by the potential of something bad happening with no guarantee that it's going to happen, the one that keeps you in a very limited state in the long term. I mean, that one scares the fuck out of me. The one that, like, you're already at the finish line, and like from here, the only thing you can do is coast by. That's terrifying. Every time that you've ever done something in life, anytime I've ever done something, it has been because I wanted something else. There's been a motivation. Even when you're avoiding doing something, you're still getting what you want. You're wanting to avoid a discomfort. Cool. You picked a decision, a behavior that allowed you to do so. They're picking an outcome that you deem is favorable. Now, with a client, like, I want to understand, like, I want to really hone in on what is it that you want. So I'll be like, hey, tell me what you want to look like, and don't dilute it into like a little bit better. I want to look good for my age. Like, no, tell me the biggest dream that you have physique wise. Like, use a visual reference point. Like, use someone on Instagram that looks insane, or use a celebrity. Like, tell me, if you were completely fearless and you didn't have the overarching like anxiety or concept around, what if I can't, what would that look like? What would you chase? And how would you feel? Like, how to feel? How do you want to feel when you get to that body? Do you want to feel completely exhausted, like just waiting for this to be over? Do you want to feel regret because you're like, fuck, like I used a lot of drugs to get here, and like now my voice doesn't even sound like me, my clit's huge, and like frankly, I don't know if it was totally worth it. This is where I kind of come down on, like, I don't want someone to be general. I want them to be very specific, because I want to understand, like, where are they trying to go? And based on what I can see, what are they willing to do to get there? What are they willing to sacrifice? Because like many people can achieve their goal and can get to a point of true, like they can achieve their dream body without having to make the sacrifice of virilizing. Like, that's just something I refuse to believe in. Like, because frankly, you can build a lot of muscle and sit at a relatively low body fat and look fucking like banging, like you guys, or having had these drugs in place in excessive amounts. The bigger hang up is showing the discomfort that they're going to feel in that off season, the uneasiness, those first few months. Ultimately, that is what's going to facilitate a better outcome for them. That's what's going to make their life better, is going through that. But that's most things in life. Like, the things in life that are good for you and that make you feel good, they typically don't feel good in the moment. You typically have to do a lot of things that don't feel very good for an extended period of time. It's your job as a coach to bridge that clarity between confusion and an understanding. And it really comes down to identifying where the fear actually lies for that client. You help them solve that problem of like, this is the fear, it's the discomfort. Like I just can't stand the idea of my stomach and like being in like for them, or you make the framework of how you're going to solve these problems for them. And I promise you, they are going to be able to make decisions not only faster, but without hesitation. They're also going to build a trust in you because like they have an understanding, but you have to calibrate their expectations. I mean, you can't promise them something that you can't deliver on. So like someone who's like, I don't want to see my scale weight go up. I'm like, that's impossible. By definition, the thing that we need to do, it's going to require that your scale weight go up actually. And if it doesn't go up, that means like we're not doing a good job. That means that my prescription of this program needs adjusting. Now, frankly, when I lay out the timeline, this has been something that like it really caught a lot of positive traction, and a lot of people loved having that set, like, okay, every single week, here's what I should expect to be gaining or aiming to gain. And if I'm not gaining this, well, then I know that I'm probably not on the right track. That means we need to make an adjustment. For one, it removes the doubt in their mind that I'm just dicking around like, oh, I wonder how much we're going to increase your, they know, it'd be like, oh, Corey made this adjustment to my food because of X, Y, and Z. Oh, I wasn't tracking very strictly for this week and my weight went up a little bit higher. So my options, either I can track stricter this week or we can pull food down for a couple of days and recalibrate. Measurements, training performance pictures, how training is actually going to feel. These are all things that like the more confidence the client has going into a build, like understanding what will these things look like. Measurements, I don't expect them to increase week to week. Monthly incremental, like very, very small nominal increases. That's what we're going for. Pictures, we don't want them to look shittier. Over the course of a month, I hope you don't look shittier. And if you look shittier, if you look softer, if you look like you gained body fat and weight went up tremendously without performance going up, then I can probably assume that you didn't really gain muscle. But I think in the same token, it's important to really have that belief that it is okay for clients to provide feedback. Like we need that qualitative data. Whenever I go through like my athlete feedback section, which was a big game changer whenever I included this in the weekly intake, it's like, okay, here are the 5 components that I need to understand where the client's at every week in real time. And I need them to be prompted to answer these things. I don't need to dig for them because ultimately, every time that I have to ask, I mean, like distracted, they're going to be busy. They're not going to feel as if they can open up. So every week, not only that they have the ability to, but hey, like this is valuable information. So the 5 components, like body composition, like you've lived in your body your whole pictures. What are the things that you see like day to day that indicate you are getting leaner or you're getting fatter? Whenever you get out of the shower, like I'm sure there's like a line somewhere that you're like, yo, like whenever I am really dialed in, I tend to see this show up and I know this is a positive indication. I should continue doing what I'm doing. Okay, cool. That's helpful. Adaptive components. Like in a prep, I want to know like when are these things becoming so dysregulated, because that's going to pre-collect data in a way and tell us like generally the body fat or the body weight in which we can expect you to feel like a human again. Now, if someone is in an off season, I need to know if like maybe they started off dysregulated, but now we're 5 pounds up over the course of, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months. And we're like, yeah, your body fat has not changed. Do you feel just as dysregulated? Okay, you probably are in a state where we need to increase body fat. Whereas if someone's in an off season, whereas if someone's in a build, if they are still dysregulated despite weight going up, I mean, visually that can be helpful, but it can also tell me that like, hey, this person is probably still far away from their true body fat set point where they feel good, where their body is able to re-regulate some of these adaptations. Rate of change. How do you feel about what we're doing? Is it faster? Is it slower than you were expecting? I mean, some people come to me and they're like, hey, a 1% drop per week, never going to happen because I have struggled to lose even like half a pound in a week's time my entire life. Like that to me would make me happy. So a loss of like 1.2 pounds, like that's absolutely absurd. I can't even fathom that. It's going to be really hard for me to stick to. I need to know these things in advance. Same thing for someone who, let's say, they have always fluctuated between like 3 pounds. Well, if month one, if I have them up 3 pounds in 2 weeks, like they're going to feel pretty uncomfortable because to them, like the latency of those changes, like it didn't take a lot of time for them to get to that point where they're already ready to tap out. These considerations have to be made. And then also, like, is it challenging to maintain the diet? I need to know, like, I want to know when they're in like the yellow zone, like if we're talking like yellow, orange, red being like, I can't fucking do this anymore, I need to take a break. If that's the case, like I need to know when they're in the yellow zone, because that's going to dictate decisions I make around their diet, around making modulations, increasing or decreasing calories. And having that information is also going to tell me like, what is the course of this phase? Like, how much longer do we actually have? If someone's hitting a yellow zone at the end of prep and they're in the last like 4 to 6 weeks and they're like, yo, I'm struggling a little bit with like adherence. I'm having some thoughts I probably shouldn't have. I'm having to like leave the kitchen because, I'm really, really wanting to just binge. I'm like, okay, yo, like we're 4 weeks out. Like, let's try to restructure things. But it's good to know we're at the tail end versus someone who's early on, who's like, let's just say they're in the first like couple weeks of prep and they're like, yo, I'm really struggling with adherence. Like, that's going to be a much different conversation with that athlete compared to the athlete who's at the tail. Honestly, I need to know not what I want to hear, not what they want to tell me, but I need to know like where they actually are, because ultimately this is going to allow for better decision making. They could be doing everything on paper that I'm asking them to do, but frankly, if they are still executing in a way that they're like, yeah, I'm adherent, but I know that there are some areas I could be better about. I know I'm not like spreading my water out evenly, and I'm finding that it is affecting my strength on days that I go into my session completely fasted. I haven't drank anything all morning. Cool. I'm going to make a point to do better about that this week. I think that's a really healthy practice to ensure that the athlete is being accountable, not just for what's on the plan, but their understanding of the plan. It allows them to critically think and kind of put pieces together, which then the next part is like your feedback. If you were coaching yourself, what would you do this week? Because I can't tell you how many times like I have been very like systematic and like, hey, this is what we're going to do with this athlete. Ultimately, to talk with the athlete a little bit and be like, yo, still like I was going to lower food. Okay, they are having a lot of like marital issues. They're, kids, like different things in their personal life that now are going to make even their state previously, it's going to become seemingly harder over the next few months. Yeah, this isn't a good idea. Like, I need to understand that wherever they are, the environment that they're in, they might have valuable insight. They might have insight that ultimately is valuable to what adjustments need to be made. And just because we have this framework in place, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take into consideration in individuality and preferences. And if this person's like, hey, I'm doing well, I really want to ride this out, I feel confident that this is the right decision. I mean, ultimately, I want to let them do that. Unless there is a rationale to not do that. In that case, we can have a discussion about it. But without having that key piece of information around like what they would do or what they would do if they were, the captain, if they were driving the ship, it becomes hard. You're just working off that framework without any of their feedback in real time. Truly, you have to reinforce the agency that they have, and that there is a lot that goes into individuals like switching gears into, okay, the goal of this phase is to gain weight. I need to gain weight in order for this phase to be successful. I think as a coach and like even as an athlete for myself, what's worked really well is like verbalizing at any point I can decide not to do this. If I no longer feel like this is aligned with my goals or what I want to do, I can pull out. Like, this is a choice. And as the coach, like enforcing that, like, hey, I'm here to support you like every step of the way. Like I just want you to see out your fullest potential, even if that is in a non-linear fashion. When we really start to think about like the current practice in how coaches establish buy-in with their clients, it's really a shame because a lot of them will take a very authoritative approach. And frankly, like the only way that you get someone to do anything is to convince them that they want to do it. Like, they have to see the value in it. If it's driven out of fear or the desire to please you, I mean, sure, they're going to do it while you're present, while there's supervision. But ultimately, when when they're off on their own or they have the ability to cheat, they're going to. You don't want to develop a reinforcement system that is purely negative. Like, exclusively, that has been shown to be less effective than a positive reinforcement. And this could be something that really starts with like establishing from a client's perspective, like telling them, hey, this is what we're not going to do. You come to me and you report non-adherence. You fucked up. Okay. Hey, I'm a human too. I'm very gluttonous. I like high calorie food and I can have eaten a lot of it in my lifetime. Be a dick. I'm not going to tell you to fuck off and that like you need to get with the program because like this is why you hired me and you just need to follow what I'm saying and don't ask any questions. Like, criticism is not an effective way to get someone to do what you want. And I think from like a coach's standpoint, it's a terrible business strategy, but it's also a cop-out. Like, it is easier. And I can't tell you like how many times I've had clients, they check in and they report, okay, like I ate off track, but there's always typically a rationalization. There's always a justification. So like they've already given you the reason why they did something. Why doesn't actually change the behavior? Even if it's a good reason, it doesn't change what actually happened. And if we're in this role, like my job isn't to justify what happened. I can receive, and that can be an input that I consider and be like, okay, this might need to be considered in order to determine whether or not a change to the entire program needs to be made. But frankly, like, you're not going to get a client to do what you want if they're just doing it to make you happy. Like, they have to see the value in them not performing, not cheat. It doesn't mean you can't want to eat off track. Something that I think is like super powerful is honestly identifying that, hey, I'm having these reoccurring urges to eat off track. Even though I'm technically eating a high enough amount of food that I shouldn't have these urges. What do you suggest we do about them? What needs to happen? Because I mean, that's a conversation. Like, now they're coming to you with a potential problem. You're now able to fulfill that solution. And this is also a dialogue, like for listeners who don't have coaches, but who are specifically like, I want to instill this practice for myself because that is, I'm self-coached. Like, that's how I've developed some of the habits that I have today. A lot of the habits that I've had today is I've literally switched between hats of like athlete coach, and like listen to the dialogue that athlete me is needing to speak up about, because frankly, like the program might no longer be conducive with what my needs are. Being honest about these needs and accepting that like, hey, this whole white knuckle approach, I'm going to like strangulate my prep into the outcome that I want. Like, it's not sustainable. And this isn't one of those things where I'm like, oh, like everything needs to be healthy. And like no, fucking bodybuilding is extreme. And like, y'all seen how I get, like, I am an extreme, I'm an intense individual. And like, a lot of what I do is not sustainable. But I also think that can be the case. I can be as I am, that can be who I am, and I can enjoy that and it can result in better outcomes while still being honest that there are times where I need to slow down and I need to be honest about the needs that are potentially not being met by myself. And that is really going to be like the game changer, I would say, whenever you're talking about someone who is deep into that off season, motivation is low, because like, you got to remember, it's not like in a fat loss phase where you get that weekly reward. You're going to have to come up with ways to reward yourself. And maybe initially, like this sounds so dumb, but like my rewards for myself was like, you did the thing that you didn't want to do. Good job. That makes you better. Like, there were conversations I would have like in my head about like, well, I don't see the changes that I want to see quite yet. I'm going to continue because I said I would, and I want to be someone who follows through with my commitments. I've already put a lot into this and I think it's worth seeing out. That to me feels really good. That is rewarding. That is an equivalent of like seeing a check and being like, oh yeah, like I did lose weight. To me, knowing that I can delay that gratification, and maybe that delay is like several months, maybe it's even longer than that, because we're not just talking about the build itself. We're talking about the period after that where you got to be like, yo, like, it's only once you get back to your leanest physique that you can like visually confirm and be like, yeah, like I did build X amount of muscle. I know that's hard. I know it's hard. And it's not something I would pretend I don't still struggle with. I do. But you get better at it. And it does get that you do it. And the more times that you sit with that discomfort and you build that self-belief, you build that belief that like today is the day, like you can give yourself, like as small as the actions actually are, you can give yourself that equity to move forward and do it again. And then you move forward and do it again. And you do that 1,000 times. Then eventually you're like, fuck, I just built for 6 months. I put on 2-3 pounds of actual tissue. My glutes look insane. Like, this is amazing. And then you cut down and you repeat. I'm gonna do it one more time. Being very realistic about what you expect from yourself. If you're someone who is very, very averse to gaining weight, this could be too big of an ask. And maybe the answer isn't like going and throwing yourself into this build, but maybe it's taking baby steps. I mean, there have been clients who've come to me who are like, I'm going to make this hard and I'm sorry in advance, because truly the state I'm in, even the fact that I'm here, is like, that in itself is a challenge for me. Like admitting that I know I need to do this despite not being able to do it on my own. I feel shame around that. And for the client that is like very concerned and very hesitant, the approach isn't this like, well, you hired me for a reason. It's like, okay, we're going to go as slow as you need to. And you're going to trust that I mean that when I say it. Like, I'm going to give you my word and I want that to mean something. So the first week when you're like really nervous about like gaining weight and you're like, hey, my scale weight is up 0.2 pounds. And I know that's not much, but it does make me anxious. I'm not going to shit on you. I'm going to empathize and I'm going to be like, yeah, we're good. We're good. I expected this. I was hoping this would happen. That tells me we don't need to increase food. Let's consider the pros and cons of this. I think trust does have to be developed. And I think it can go a long way for athletes that do struggle with this. So I encourage you as coaches to let that develop, to not rush it, to not expect it, to really go out of your way to earn that trust that you're going to actually do what you say. And as an athlete, really being honest about like, hey, do their behaviors line up with what we agreed upon? And are my expectations, like, are my feelings around this, are they realistic, but are they also fair considering what I'm asking him to do? I hope y'all enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you would, leave me a comment, leave me a like, subscribe if you would, rating, leave me a rating on Spotify. They don't do ratings on YouTube, but throw a comment, something in there. If you're interested in one-on-one coaching, please hit the link in the show notes. I have got 15-minute consultations for new clients and then 45-minute consultations for clients who maybe they don't need one-on consult. Maybe they just need 45 minutes of my time to just go through their cycle design, their training program, their diet, their timeline, their goals, their physique. We can do whatever you want, but links to both of those in the show notes. I've also got 2 webinars coming up: hormonal imbalances and lab work. We're going to be talking about exact reference ranges. That's going to be April 16th, April 18th. 16th is at 11 a.m. 18th is at 3 p.m. As always, if you're not subbed to the Patreon, and the Patreon is growing, if that's something that you want to be a part of, you can ask individual questions. I do answer those in semi-long form formats. Do that for tier 2 members, so $10 a month. I think that's it. I think I'm ready to go eat and take a nap. So thank you for watching. As always, I will see you in the next one.